Okay, advanced procrastinators, what we are doing today is we are looking at thematic reviews of what you might need to know for the DBQ, and today we are going over immigration. So this is not everything, but a basic review of what you want to have in front of you for the DBQ in case of questions about immigration. So let's get into the beginning of the first wave of immigration to America, 1754 to the 1820s. And being that this exam will begin at 1754, we will start there. Now, keep in mind in 1754, 1755, that would be the pie chart on the right here, right? You can see that it is primarily in blue English immigration, which is 50% of America, and African American immigration. Okay, right. So 55, actually 20% of African American. Now, keep in mind there are three other groups that are going to come to America. Is going to be the Germans at 7%, the Scott Irish. They are Scots that moved to Ireland to try to make a better life for themselves and didn't find that in Ireland, so they came to America, and then the Irish at 5%. Now, what you want to understand here is predict the impact of this mingling and diversity of settlers will have on the future of the colonies, right? Well, the first one is to help you out with the question is you have a diversity of ethnic groups, and this creates a people who are not English. Yes, the colonies are the English colonies, but the people in all of the colonies are not all English. You can see actually half of the people in the colonies are not English at all. They are from other groups of people. And it's going to help to create an American culture and spur the American Revolution. And then the other one is you have a diversity of beliefs and ideas, right? This is going to create an identity different from Europe. This will help lead to the Second Great Awakening and reform movements in the 1830s. Now, the second wave of immigration between the 1840s and 1860s primarily focuses on two groups of people. It's going to be the Irish and the Germans. So let's talk about the Irish, right? Now, the reason why they start coming in the 1840s is because of the potato famine, right? The Irish are controlled by the English. The English own pretty much all of the farms. So the Irish are renting on these farms without much ability to earn a living, and potatoes just grew freely, and it was a source of nutrition for most of the Irish. A disease impacted the potatoes. The potatoes ended up dying. The Irish started to starve to death, right? So a lot of them, the only choice was to come to the United States. And when they came to the United States, this is what you need to understand. They found themselves only living in Boston and New York, not spreading around America, because once they got off the boat, they were too poor to move west and buy land, right? And because they were so centralized in these areas and looking so destitute, you had NINA, the idea of no Irish need apply. These were signs that were posted in businesses that said help wanted, NINA, meaning we need people to work here, but we're not going to hire Irish, right? Because they were upset that the Irish might work for less money and they're taking American jobs. Now, one thing to keep in mind is why are the Americans so unforgiving to the Irish, right? And what you need to keep in mind is a lot of my students want to say, well, they're the first non-white ethnic group. Yes, they are the first poor, unskilled, discriminated immigrant group, but they were white. Okay, so it's not has nothing to do with race. As I said, a problem was one, they were poor and they gathered in Boston, New York City, so they looked like this they looked as if there's more of them than there really were in those towns. Also, the other problem is that they were Catholic, and we'll get to that in a second, right? Now, the second wave of Irish immigration are going to be the Germans, right? And you can see here that they really start coming here. I mean, you can look at total immigration to America. The Germans, if you're not English in America or Irish, you're probably going to be of some kind of German descent if you're of European descent. And you can see in 1840 to 1850, almost 1860, is when there's a huge increase of the Irish, and it's almost one third of all Americans, right? Now, how are they different from the Irish when they arrived, and where did they settle? Well, the Germans, when they came here with some money. So when they got off the boat, they were able to move to the Midwest to, say, Wisconsin or Minnesota and those areas, right? And also to keep in mind about Germany at the same time, too, is Germany is not a nation, but it's lots of different principalities. So the Germans didn't all look at themselves as just being German. Yes, they shared a common language, right? But there's different types of Germans, which meant there's both Protestant Germans and Catholic Germans. So it wasn't like just one religious group coming over here and Americans could identify them as all being the same. Also, the Germans were always able to fit in because English is a Germanic language that's mixed in with Latin. So as far as the Germans trying to fit in and learn English, it was a little easier for them to do than say if you were Russian, right? Now, something that the Russians did do that upset Americans is they drank on Sundays, right? During this time period, the 1840s and 50s, when the Second Great Awakening is going on and Americans are starting to rediscover their religion, right? And using Sunday as a holy day. The Germans are taking Sunday as their day off and getting together in social parties and drinking, which upset a lot of Americans. Now, what else was it about the Germans? Why they were not targeted, even though they're an immigrant group, they were not targeted as harshly as the Irish. And the thing is, right, is here, as I said, they were able to blend into American society, right? They were middle class and they became farmers and they became entrepreneurs. They became brewers. Most of the breweries in America were started by the Germans, right? So they started becoming part of the American dream. And another one is they spread out across the United States. They were not centralized in only New York or Boston, right? They're all over America. So they didn't stand out as a large group trying to compete with Americans for jobs. There was just a a sparse mingling of Germans throughout the United States, right? Now, there was, though, keep in mind, a reaction against these immigrants, right? A nativist reaction. And one of the best examples of it is the American Party, otherwise known as the Know Nothings, okay? And their idea is that they're and America is for native born. That means people born in the United States, Americans and immigrants have no place. Okay. And the American Party, what I'm saying here is you might want to know is this is a political party dedicated to being anti-immigrant. It'd be as if the KKK became a political party. They just didn't vote with a political party. They were a political party, and their goal was to keep down African Americans. Well, that's what this American Party is, or the Know Nothings, right? They hate foreigners, right? Now, why do these immigrants hate the Germans and the Irish? Because there is hate against the Germans as well too, right? And obviously, number one is that they're taking our jobs, right? That's how Americans looked at it, right? There's so many of them here, and they're working in these factory jobs. But do keep in mind, the Irish working in factory jobs are taking the worst jobs in America, right? They're taking the jobs that Americans didn't want. In fact, factory jobs, when they began, were reserved for women because everyone thought that the jobs were so bad, right? Nobody would want them permanently. And young women, called Lowell girls from where they worked in Lowell, Massachusetts, the idea would be they'd come and they work when they're 17, 18 years old. And by the time they're 21 or 22, they'd get married and they move on with their life. It was not meant to be permanent work. Well, when the Irish came, they were willing to do it as permanent work. And the other one is they are Catholic. And remember, what is the problem with people being Catholic in America? Don't they believe in Jesus Christ? Yes, they do. But the majority of Americans are Protestant, right? And Catholics follow the Pope. So the idea here is rather than following the President of the United States or the ideas of America, they might be influenced by the ideas of the Pope, right? Now, the American Party, right, as a political party, what was their ideas? Because you have to, you know, political agenda, right? And they're the first group that wants to put a restriction on immigration, right? Up until this time, in fact, up until the 1920s, there's no limit on immigration. So when people say, I came to America legally, that's because all you needed to do is get off of a boat, right? Also, they wanted deportation for immigrants as well, also, right? Now, another thing about the Know Nothings is you see in the upper left-hand corner is they were famous for actually going out and beating up immigrants. Okay, very much like how the Klan would target and lynch African Americans, the Know Nothings would do the same things with the Irish in their towns, right? But here's something to think of, right? There really weren't that many acts of violence against immigrants because the immigrants are coming are a huge amount of people, and why were there not more acts of violence? Well, keep this in mind. The American economy was large enough for all people to make money. As I said, the immigrants are taking jobs nobody else wants. The factory jobs. America is starting a small transition to industrialization. Also, these immigrants, they blended in and they started having a better life, right? And most importantly, the native born Americans, right? Some many of these know nothings, right? Were making money off of immigrants. Immigrants are working in factories. Well, who owns a factory? A native born American owns the factories, right? So why would you want to beat up your labor force? Now, the third wave of immigration. This is the largest wave of immigration that comes into the United States, right? And this is between the late 1800s to 1920s, right? And you have 20 million people that moved to the United States. So that means by World War One, about one quarter of all Americans are either immigrants or first generation born immigrants, right? Now, why would people want to leave their country at this time in such large numbers, right? Well, keep this in mind is you've got war. Always there's war, right? There's poverty, there's famine, there's persecution. At this time in Russia, the Jews are part of the pogroms where the Russian government's basically rounding up Jews and systematically killing them, right? Now, why do people want to come to America? Because you see on this map here, guys, you can see how many immigrants are coming to America at this time. Now, the pink And the green and the blue are higher levels, and the yellow are lower levels. Now, in the South, obviously, you have African Americans, and there's no industrialization really happening in the South that's going to attract immigrants into this area, okay? So what is it? Well, one, you have jobs over here in New York, in Boston, this area, right? You have purple, right? And this is where the new factories are being developed. But also, if you see here, the largest areas in red, right, where immigrants are moving to are over here in the West. And what you have is free land in the West at this time, the 1880s, right? You have the Homestead Act, where Americans will be given 150 acres of land by the U.S. government if you lived on it for 5 years and you paid $10, right? So if you moved to Nebraska out here in this area, you can see it's green, which is where a lot of Czechs lived, right? They could get essentially free land for moving out of this area. So this whole region over here, right, is attracting immigrants for land. There's also freedom of religion. If you're Jewish and Russian being persecuted, what better place to go to than the United States, right? And also we are a nation of laws and some basic kind of security. There might always be some targeted some targeting of immigrants and whatnot, but in general, there is a system of law in America. And also important is these immigrant groups always had a base. You're not the only person in the whole nation coming over here. If you were German, maybe you moved to Wisconsin. If you're Scandinavian, you moved to Minnesota. If you're Czech, you moved to Nebraska. If you're Irish or Italian, you moved to New York City because that's as far as you could afford to go. Okay. Now, there are two types of immigrants coming to America, and there are the good immigrants and the bad immigrants, because we've always been a nation of immigrants. Now, first off, remember, 75% of immigrants coming to America, they are coming from Europe. Europe, right? And the old immigrants are immigrants who've always been coming from Europe. That's this green line right here, okay? And these nations include Northern and Western Europe up here. We are talking England. We are talking Germany. We are talking Ireland, and we are talking Sweden or Scandinavia up here. So these countries right here are the old immigrants who've always been coming to America, and they were seen as being the good immigrants, right? They were acceptable because they were lighter skinned, they were Protestant, and obviously for English or Irish, you're English speaking. If you're German, you can learn English, and Swedes, they speak some English over there as well too. Now, what's going to change here is after right here, here's the big year right here, 1890. You see it right here, right? It goes from old immigrants being the majority to new immigrants being the majority. And you can see in the next decade, in the 1900, it's an overwhelming amount of new immigrants coming here. So who are these people? They're coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, right? We're talking Italy, we're talking Russia, we're talking Poland right here. Okay, part of Austria-Hungary, right? Now, these immigrants were seen as being the negative immigrants because a couple reasons. One, they were darker skin, they were Jewish in Russia or Catholic in Italy, and they spoke a dramatically different language. Another one to keep in mind, guys, it's not just the fact that they were slightly different. It is, look at the numbers of them that are coming here. At the height of old immigrants in 1881, 1882, right, we're talking less than 3 million people in a whole decade, right? Here, all of a sudden, in 1901 and 1910, right, we have double the number here. And if you add up all of these together, you're talking the triple the number of old immigrants. So not are they slightly more undesirable because of some of their background or their tendencies, but there's an enormous amount of them. And because there's so many of them, guys, this is important to remember. There was a resistance for them to change and become American, right? There wasn't the need to have to become American, right? You had ethnic enclaves like Little Italy in New York City. And if you lived in Little Italy, you didn't have to speak English because everybody in Little Italy or that part of New York City all spoke Italian. So there wasn't that forcible need where you say, "Oh, I'm going to become an American." So a lot of Americans saw these immigrants who, could just get along with their life as if they were in their old country in the New World, right, in America, right, as them being resistant to ever being an American and fitting in. And you know what's added to it is you get the Americanization movement, which is the beginning of education, public education in America in a lot of ways in the cities, with the idea to indoctrinate these new immigrants who might be resistant to change become Americans by teaching them English and U.S. history. Now, another thing that's happening is you have the Red Scare, right? In the 1920s, you have fear of communism, where many immigrants believe that these new immigrants were communists, right? So Americans start targeting these immigrants as Reds, and they set limits on immigration for the very first time ever. So it's in the 1920s we get the first limits, and this is tied to one, the number of immigrants, new immigrants, but also the fact they might be communists. Now, why would Americans think immigrants would be communists? Well, one, a lot of immigrants are coming from Russia, right? And Russia is communist, and communism promises to spread its ideology around the world, right? So there's a home base. Also, communism is an ideology where the poor will take over for the rich. So these immigrants are poor. If they weren't poor, they probably wouldn't be coming to America because they had a good life in their own country, right? So people are afraid that they might be attracted to this idea. Now, the Palmer raids, Attorney General Mitchell Palmer arrests, intimidates, and deports thousands of immigrants for being communists, right? Now, what you need to realize is, why is deporting immigrants for being communists a violation of civil rights? Because this is a crime in American history, right? And the reason why is the Second Amendment. You have freedom of assembly and speech in America. It's not illegal to be communist or believe in communism. But the United States still rounded up people, immigrants, for suspected of being communists and sent them back home. We also end up with the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, which this is the first limit ever on immigration, where we said only 3% of the population living in America in 1910 could immigrate. So if there was a million Italians, that means 30,000 Italians can move into America every year. 30,000, 3% of a million, right? And that's based on 1910, which is the last census, right? The census in 1920 hadn't been done yet. Now, for a lot of Americans, that was a problem because it's too many Italians. So what they did is they changed the Immigration Act of 1924 and set an even stricter immigration law of 2% of the population, not 3%, but this time it was based on 1890, right? And remember the numbers that we had in 1890. Okay, now instead of there being, say, a million Italian immigrants, there's only 100,000 Italian immigrants, and 2% of 100,000 is 2,000, and 2,000 is a better number for some Americans than 30,000. We also banned all Japanese immigration, which we'll get to in a second, which is the second group we banned, but there's no limit on Mexican immigration. Now, let's talk about three other groups that were coming to America at this time you want to recognize. As we said, 75% of people coming to America are coming from Europe. Where's everyone else coming from? We're talking about Chinese, Japanese, and Mexicans. And most of them, a lot of them are settling in California. Mexicans are also going to Texas as well, too. But let's start with the Chinese, right? What is the difficulty for the Chinese? Well, obviously, they stand out and they look and sounded vastly different. But just like the Irish being targeted because they're centralized in one location, like in New York City or in Boston, right? The Chinese are centralized in San Francisco, right? And what happened to them is they become a target of organized racism by a group called the Kernites. The K is similar to KKK. The Kernites are not Klan, but if it helps you guys remember it, they are a vigilante group like the Know Nothings as well too, who targeted the Irish. The Kernites targeted the Chinese, right? And when America's solution to make sure that Californians didn't target the Chinese anymore was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned all immigration of the Chinese to the United States. So it's the first limit on immigration ever in American history, and it's the first time we ever banned a whole group of people coming to the United States. Now, when the Chinese are banned, you get another group of Asians coming over, the Japanese, and they came to America in the 1890s, and they actually came as more middle class immigrants, and they started becoming middle class, and that kind of upset Americans. Like, wow, these guys are coming to this nation and doing a good job. Okay, so what American Californians did is, number one, we had segregated schools in California where Japanese could not attend schools with whites, right? And in another effort to try to limit the number of Japanese coming here, rather than banning all Japanese immigration, President Teddy Roosevelt in Japan agreed to voluntary limits on Japanese immigration to the United States, right? Meanwhile, shortly after that, California passed something called the California Alien Land Law, right? This was an effort to try to prevent the Japanese from being successful farm owners by preventing non-Americans from owning land, right? And the Japanese immigrants were prohibited from becoming U.S. citizens. That was a Supreme Court case, Ozawa versus the U.S. Now, of course, if you're a first generation born in America Japanese, if you're Nisei Japanese, you could buy land, but their parents couldn't buy land, right? And finally, in an effort to try to impact Japanese immigration, in the Immigration Act of 1924, America banned all Japanese immigration, which is the second time we ever banned all groups. And the last group are Mexicans, right? Now, what's the deal with Mexicans? As we mentioned before, they're actually being invited into the United States, right? Because we've banned Chinese immigration and we're not really letting the Japanese in anymore. The West needs to come up with another source of labor, and that's going to be Mexicans. In the 1902 Reclamation Act, the government is trying to irrigate farms in the West and create farming like in states like California. So California is looking for laborers, and this creates jobs for Mexicans. Meanwhile, at the same time, you have the Mexican Civil War happening, where many Mexicans are leaving Mexico to try to escape death, starvation, and crime that's happened in Mexico's time, right? So there is a pull factor to America, the Reclamation Act, and a push factor, the Mexican Civil War. So keep this in mind. There's no limit on Mexican immigration in the 1920s. Now, in the 1930s, that will change with the Great Depression. Okay, so that is a good start for immigration, guys. If you have those memorized or written down or just kind of formalized on a sheet of paper so you can access it for outside information and maybe contextualization for immigration, guys, you should be in a good place for the AP exam. Have a good day, guys.